Guangdong has changed enormously in the last century or so. It's now a heavily industrialised area, ringed with roads and infrastructure factories everywhere. But back in the 1850s, it was much more of a rural place. There were no roads, it was crisscrossed with waterways, and it was also subject to a lot of disorder. There'd been the Red Turban Revolt in the mid-1850s, which had been a failed attempt to dislodge the Qing government from this area. And in its wake, there was heavy repercussions on the young men, particularly of this area. So many of them took off overseas. They went to get away, and they discovered overseas great opportunities, which led to more men going away. Here, in this ancestral home in Choie Sew village, one young man left as part of that flow. His steps would take him out this door and away to California first, then to Victoria in Australia, and finally to Otago, New Zealand. His father's name is above the door. That young man was Choie Sew Hoy.
He probably be one of the more adventurous, so probably heard about the gold rushes over in California. Somehow he was able to learn some English. Then he heard about Otago strike here.
By the time he came to New Zealand in 1868, he had a wife and some small children back in Guangdong. In New Zealand, he went up to Lawrence and was involved in mining and storekeeping operations up there. And then in 1869 or so, he went down to Dunedin and established his famous store, which became really, in time, the most important of all the stores in Dunedin and the centre of a network spreading right up through the goldfields in which Choie Sew Hoy had many mining interests. Now originally Sew Hoy's store was here in Stafford Street on the opposite side of the road to the present store, and there were a number of other Chinese stores down here such that it was a Chinese quarter. But in 1895 Sew Hoy moved across the road and built the store that still bears his name today. Has the date on the top, 1869, commemorating his arrival in Dunedin to establish his presence here. And eventually this became the premier Chinese store to supply not just the men from Upper Purniu, but all over the place. And it really is the central spot in Dunedin Chinese history in many, many ways.
His main aim was want to be a general merchant, importing things, supplying the food, equipment, everything to the gold miners.
But as an ambitious man, Sew Hoy heard stories from older miners how there was still plenty of gold in central Otago, only it was too deep to be extracted with traditional methods. Inspired by the dredge that he had seen at work on Otago Harbour, Sew Hoy took a gamble. He purchased a dredge, modified it for river use, and put it to work at Big Beach on the Shotover River.
So we're just 10 minutes from Queenstown over that hill. Coronet Peak up behind me, the skiing centre, the Shotover River, thronged with jet boats and so on. So a very busy recreational area here, but right in the middle of it, and I suppose most people wouldn't even notice as they go about, this beach, a really important historic site, the place where gold dredging really took off in New Zealand thanks to Choie Sew Hoy. He was a very innovative man, and in 1888, building on stories he'd heard from various miners about lots of gold being under this big beach in the Shotover River, he developed a dredging system up here that was to make a new phase of gold mining possible in which many, many people made fortunes. But Choie Sew Hoy, his operation here began in 1888 at Big Beach on the Shotover River, was the first. By the late 19th century, the Chinese were left as remnants of gold fields here with very little pick over, and they were small-scale fossickers. That's the memory they kind of left behind. But by that time, there was a new phase of gold mining in this area, driven by technological innovation, pioneered in fact by a Chinese, the most talked about gold miner in 19th century Otago, Choie Sew Hoy. His operation at Big Beach had developed the New Zealand gold dredge. By 1900, along this stretch of the river between Alexandra and Roxburgh, there were 187 dredges operating. That's the biggest gold fleet dredge the world has ever seen. And one of those dredges alone, in a good week, could bring up 1,000 ounces of gold from the riverbed. So ironically, although those small-scale fossickers, the old Chinese, were picking out tiny bits of gold from the riverbanks here still in that period, those big dredges out there owed their development to the most outstanding Chinese gold seeker of all,
Choie Sew Hoy.
Unfortunately, he did not patent the dredges, and I think within a certain time, few months later, there were many hundreds of them copycats throughout the world.
In many ways, Choie Sew Hoy was the first Chinese to fully integrate into New Zealand society.
Now, he was very highly regarded by his fellow countrymen and also by Europeans. He was very fluent in English, which really helped out. He took a younger European wife here as well, and had some children in New Zealand. And he became very integrated into the community. He joined a Masonic lodge. People began to call him Charles Sew Hoy. He dropped his clan name as far as Europeans went. His descendants still go by that name, Sew Hoy, as their surname in New Zealand today.
By the time hydraulic sluicing became common in Otago, the majority of Chinese had returned home. But Sew Hoy and his son Kumpoi shrewdly invested in claims around Nokamai, further enhancing the family reputation.
In 1894, Sew Hoy and his son Kumpoi shifted their attention down here to Nokamai. Now at that point the Nokamai goldfield had been more or less abandoned, but news of Sew Hoy's interest sparked a major revival in tension. There was a flood of new mining applications and a sustained mining boom followed. Now Sew Hoy and Kumpoi themselves developed a major elevated hydraulic sluicing came here, which was pretty unusual for the Chinese. They tended to be much more basic level operations, but this was technologically much grander scale, and it was very successful. They actually had to float a company to sustain operations. They did that in 1898, and it continued long after Sew Hoy himself died in 1901, right through to 1943. And for much of that time, it was in fact the most successful sluicing operation in New Zealand. Here we are well up the Nokamai Valley, and this chimney is all that remains of the manager's house for the Nokamai Sluicing Company. I think what it reminds us of is the exceptional nature of Sew Hoy and Kumpoi in the Chinese gold seeker sort of era, and that they were able to move effortlessly between European and Chinese worlds. They had the language skills, able to speak English well, they had the business acumen, they had the financial resources to engage in a sophisticated company structure that was required to mount the sort of operation needed to recover gold in this way.
He went into the Nokamai, and we can see the relics of the other equipment down there.
This peaceful spot here up in the Nokamai Valley, a duck pond now, the foliage regrowing, but once upon a time this land was ripped up and torn over. This is actually a dredge hole. These river valleys were churned and turned, and they made a real mess of the landscape. But it's amazing how, not that many years later, it's all softened, and there are very few remnant elements which remind us of what happened here long ago. On the hillsides we see the water races, we see sometimes abandoned pipes from the hydraulic sluicing operations, and the duck pond.
Considering the hard time many Chinese received from Europeans, it was perhaps ironic that most of the men employed by Sew Hoy and Kumpoi at Nokamai were European. After his father's death in Dunedin, Kumpoi managed the company successfully for another 42 years.
And when it finished in 1943, it was in fact the last of the Chinese gold seeker operations in the country. So if we think back to 1866, when those first small parties of Chinese came and began to explore and develop that first little footprint over in central Otago, here we are 80 years later at the very place where the great New Zealand Chinese gold seeker era ended. Paddy's Alley, Nokamai, Northern Southland.
Sew Hoy entrusted the operating of companies such as Nokamai to his sons Kumpoi and Kumyok. In later life, he rarely ventured into the hinterland to oversee proceedings, preferring to stay close to his successful businesses in Dunedin. In 1886, when he was 50, Sew Hoy formed a relationship with his 17-year-old English secretary, Lily Prescott. They lived here at 802 Cumberland Street, just opposite the North Ground in the North Dunedin flat. Quite a humble sort of residence really for a man of his means. They had 2 children together. They went to local Anglican private schools and later on married Europeans and merged pretty seamlessly into Dunedin society, as indeed had their father. Though he was Chinese, he could speak English fluently, he could read and write, he was very much integrated into business circles here in Dunedin. His name was on all the subscription lists, and where most Chinese were referred to disparagingly in the local press, he was always Mr. Sew Hoy. Now in later life, he became rather overweight and suffered from vascular disease, and in July 1901, on his way to work and waving goodbye to Lily, he died just here in the gateway at 802 Cumberland Street. So after his death in July 1901, Choie Sew Hoy was buried here in the Anglican section of Dunedin Southern Cemetery. It's a beautiful spot for a grave. It has excellent view out over the harbour, good feng shui from a Chinese point of view. But in fact, Sew Hoy didn't intend to be buried here permanently. And 2 years later, when the great mass exhumation was finalised that he'd begun preparations for, his son Kumpoi took over those details. It included Choie Sew Hoy's body. Now his body was exhumed, it was very carefully prepared and put in a beautiful Rimu coffin, distinct from the other Chinese miners who had more humble ones. As we will see shortly, Choie Sew Hoy's body unfortunately never made it back to China, but such was his prestige that his family back home significantly benefited from his generosity and constructed an elaborate feng mu for him at Shek Kong. After Sew Hoy's death, the family back here in Shek Kong erected a feng mu for him over there on the edge of the cemetery as it is now. And later on during the Cultural Revolution, the side of the hill was cut away to make rhodium fill and his grave was destroyed. And it looked like they were also going to destroy this one, which is his son, Kumyok. But representations were made from New Zealand and they stopped just short. So Kumyok's grave survived, and subsequently the family erected a new feng mu for Choie Sew Hoy. And here it is here. Obviously, his body is not in there. A silver plaque was sent home to the family here, representing Sew Hoy, and it was buried in the feng mu here. So in a sense, his spirit is here at home in Shek Kong.
He's standing in the community. He helped a lot of people, and that's what he was creating or establishing the Xiangqing Society to help people to send back the bones overseas for the Chinese people over there and send the live Chinese gold miner that couldn't make any money here to help them pay their fare back to China.
The Punfar Association, through its Chongxing Tong, the Burial Society, maintained a cemetery and a mortuary temple somewhere near here at Shak Moon village in Upper Purniu. And that was where poor miners in New Zealand, who maybe didn't have a family who could afford to bury them properly back home, but everyone chipping in their little piece for the exhumations, their bodies would be brought back and interred there. Now the cemetery became dilapidated during the Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 45, and during the Cultural Revolution it was demolished and lost. We don't know where it was exactly, but it was somewhere around here. But one outstanding thing is remembered about that burial ground, and that is that Choie Sew Hoy chose to be buried there with the poor, sort of unloved, forgotten miners of Purniu, rather than in Dunedin or in his family's burial ground not so far away.
You know, it's really exciting if you're interested in Otago's history, particularly the Chinese dimension of it, to finally be at a place which is so critical to it. Here in Shekong village in Guangdong, this is the Sew Hoy family home. And 7 generations on from when Choie Sew Hoy left here to go to New Zealand, begin to develop that presence. The family still have this place here. It's not used anymore by the local members of the family. It's kept aside. It belongs really to the New Zealand side of the family. This is their Tūranga Waiwai, the place they whakapapa back to, the starting point. But it's not just for them either, because Sew Hoy was so critical in the development of that presence in Otago, and he gave so much assistance to so many people. Li Shong, the assistance to come out to New Zealand and get a start and assist their families back here. So if you're really trying to think about a place that's so symbolically important for the Chinese presence in New Zealand, you couldn't go far wrong in pinpointing this very spot, the Choie Sew Hoy home in Shekong village, Guangdong.
Choie Sew Hoy remains the most revered of Otago's Chinese from the gold seeker period. His generosity and support in grub-staking Chinese miners arriving in Dunedin created a legacy still visible. Even today, stories are still told of his fame.
And when the people write letter in the 1800s, from Central Otago, everything, all they put is Sew Hoy, Dunedin. In fact, all they put is Sew Hoy. One letter Sew Hoy, I got there.
But the failure of Sew Hoy's body to return home remains a blight on an otherwise illustrious career. The loss of Sew Hoy and 498 other Chinese bodies to a watery grave was to be the defining story of the gold seeker Chinese.